Hey, welcome back to the Next Gen podcast. I'm Jeff Baxter. I'm your host, and this is coming out of Mission Hills Church. We're so excited that you are tuning in a couple times a month with our Next Gen podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and thanks for all that you do to support this podcast channel. And I just want to remind you of a couple things. This is also a video cast. It's out there on YouTube and through our Mission Hills Church website. Through all of our podcast channels. You can listen to it or you can watch us as we talk about different topics related to the next generation. And if this is helpful for you, be sure to subscribe and be sure to share with those who you think it might be helpful with. I love talking to parents, youth workers, children's directors, teachers, coaches, mentors, and those who care about the next generation growing with Jesus. That's what this is all about. That is so much fun to do, and we're talking about all different kinds of topics related to the next generation that will relate to all of these different groups, from parents to youth workers to those working in the church and volunteers. And so today is an episode that's following the episode when our youth staff, a number of them, talked with one another. We were around the table in Atlanta. We were actually at a conference talking about anxiety in the next generation. I'll talk about that in just a little while, but we were around the table with our kids director, Will, middle school, high school director, pastor, Stephen, young adult director, pastor, JG, and we had a blast talking about a number of things. I just want to summarize some of those things in this episode, as well as talk about anxiety in the next generation in the second half of this podcast. So again, we were in Atlanta. We were at an anxiety conference that had to do with the next generation, and we learned so much in the breakout sessions and the main speakers. I want to share just a little bit of our conversation and a little bit about that conference. We are so excited about student leadership at our church and what's going on there, the development opportunities we have with students and chances for them to serve. We have a lot of middle school students and high school students and young adults who are serving in our kids ministry, or they're serving in all different kinds of places around the church. And it's so much fun to see them jump into ministry and be part of our church. Our kids ministry, we love the small group times that we have with them. Maybe that's true at your church or where you serve as well, if you're listening to this podcast about the next gen and you're in a different church. But, it's all about relationships with Jesus and leaders, so we're excited about that. And in our young adult ministry, it's so much fun to see young adults literally on a weekly basis here at Mission Hills Church plug into life groups, and it's fun to see them do life and their stage of life that's there. Post-high school, maybe college students, maybe young adults, but they're plugging into life. Maybe I ought to tell you a little bit of our program structure here at Mission Hills that might be helpful for you if you're not familiar with our church, but we, of course, have kids programming on the weekends. We have a Saturday night service and 3 services on Sunday. 2 of them have kids programming. The first one does not. So every week, Saturday nights and twice Sunday, we have kids programming. Our middle school ministry meets on Sunday mornings at the 11 o'clock hour, as well as our high school ministry. They're separate. They're in different rooms at our building, but they meet at 11 o'clock, and that's a little bit more discipleship time. It's a little bit more relaxed around tables, most of the time having conversations. And then on Wednesday nights, our middle school and our high school have their programming. And the way we do it here at Mission Hills is we do a staggered start. So our middle school comes in first. They're hanging out. They're eating some food, pizza, sometimes Chick-fil-A, and they're hanging out, playing games, 9 Square, Gaga Ball is what we have, and we have those set up inside of our church. For you might set those things up outside your church if you're into that kind of thing. And then after middle school has some time to eat and hang out, play games, they transition to the main room where we have a typical program, some fun elements, some dance elements, doing the monkey, doing some what we call the impossible shot. We do some active things to get them into it. Sometimes competition with our classes, 6th, 7th, and 8th against one another. And then we go into a time of worship and a time of teaching and a responsive song sometimes. And then they break out into the rest of the church building into small groups on Wednesday night as well. And when they're leaving that main room, the high school is coming in because they've been hanging out, playing some games, eating some food. Then they come into the main room and they do a typical program that I just said for middle school as well, with a fun element, maybe a reflective element. And then they do some worship, some teaching time, and then they break into small groups in the rest of the building. And at that time, middle school is getting ready to transition away and get picked up by parents and that kind of thing. So that's the structure for kids, middle school, and high school. Our young adult ministry, they're in kind of a life group, small group model every week. Most of them meet weekly. We have a number of life groups based on life stage where they meet in different homes. We have host homes. And all the host home needs to do is they just hang out, open up their home. They don't have to lead the study. That's a different person doing that. Oftentimes it's a 20-something that's leading that study. And then once a month, our young adult ministry meets on site, on our church site, call it YA Night, Young Adult Night. And they do a pretty typical program, but we kind of put the keys in the hands of the young adults, and they tell stories, they lead worship, they sometimes teach. It just depends. But that's kind of our format for young adult ministry. Of course, all of these ministries, with the exception of kids ministry, has retreats and camps that we go on. Oftentimes, sometimes we've partnered with other churches to do that, and sometimes we've done it on our own. But they all have different events that are going on. We care an awful lot about transitions in our church. I hope you do too. If you're a parent, a youth worker, a youth pastor, or even a lead pastor of a church, I hope you care about these transitions. And sometimes in smaller and medium-sized churches, you have to figure out how to do it all on your own, and I get that. But we are very intentional about the transitions from kids ministry to middle school to high school to young adults. And so we have some events that are around that, and we overlap leaders teaching, and we invite our incoming fifth graders for what we call adventure camp off campus, just to do some fun activities, to build some community with one another. And it's a great time for them to build. And then for 8th grade, moving to 9th grade, and for graduating seniors to head into young adult college ministry. And that looks a little different too, but that's a little more seasonal because some college students are coming back, of course, and they're coming back from college from far away, and they want to plug in during the summer or during the winter months around Christmas. And so we help them do that. But the transitions are super, super important for us. Some of the challenges that we talked about as a staff team, and I'm sure you have your own challenges wherever you are, is with our young adults. I mean, it's hard to say goodbye. It's hard to say goodbye to good leaders, and we're excited they get to launch and move into other parts of the church, depending on their life stage. They fall in love, they get married, all these kinds of things happen, and you got to transition them out of young adult ministry. Same is true for kids ministry. We're always, one of our challenges, I'm sure it might be true for you too, is we're always looking for good volunteers. We call them serve team, where we can discover, develop, and deploy them to be the best volunteers they can be for the kingdom. And it's hard sometimes to find that. I would say that our church probably falls into the 80-20 principle, where 20% of the people do 80% of the work, or 20% of the people give 80% of to the church through their offerings and so their generosity. Of course, we don't want it to be that way, but it's sometimes the nature of things. We have people that jump in the deep end of the pool and do 1,000 different things, and we're just trying to do our best to navigate that and get them plugged into the ministry places that are best for them. We want to maintain, high personal touch, have them be hands-on in ministry and train them to do the best they can. That's true for middle school and high school as well. Some of our challenges in student ministry is we want to help students, no matter where they are, grow with Jesus, to become like Jesus and join him on mission. We want to do that no matter where they are. And of course, probably like you, we have a variety of students. We have students that are brand new to faith in Jesus. We have students that don't know Jesus yet. Some that know the Bible really well, that are coming from a homeschooling background or a Christian school background, and others who don't know the Bible at all. And we've literally had times when we've been teaching in student ministry, and students are are engaged in the story. You're telling a story like David and Goliath in the Old Testament that seems like a story that a lot of people would know, but you'd be surprised how many in the next generation don't even know that story. And when you're sharing that story, they'll literally respond to it like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that happened. That's crazy. How did David do that? He cut off his head. I mean, all the things. And it's so much fun to hear them engage, but it's also kind of sad that they don't know all those significant stories of the Bible. And so we're doing our best. As a matter of fact, in student ministry, we're writing our own curriculum, and we are helping them see the Bible all the way through in 2 years. So we start in the New Testament, then go to the Old Testament, back to the New Testament, and then the Old Testament again, based on the semesters. And in 2 years, they have gotten an overview of the Bible, and then we start over again and do it again. And we're kind of writing the curriculum as we go. Maybe that's an idea for you if you're into church world and you're thinking about this, is maybe you want to write your own curriculum too. And of course, we rely on other sources and commentaries and Bible study tools to do this, but we write all that so that students get an overview of the Bible, and we give strong application of what difference this makes in their lives as they're moving forward. And so that's what we're about. Those are some of the challenges, though, is helping students get into the Word of God when you're teaching to a crowd that's diverse, which is true of every church in America too, but in student ministry in particular. Doing the same thing in kids ministry, where there's a lot of students and kids that know a little bit of the Bible, don't know anything about the Bible, and their parents might be in the same category, but we're doing our best to come alongside. So by the time we would have, if we, Lord willing, have a child from birth all the way through young adults, they've gotten a well-rounded view of the church, the Bible, a relationship with Jesus to help them grow along the way. If I were to summarize and just encourage you for a few minutes, if you're a parent, mentor, teacher, coach, you're a youth pastor, lead pastor, let me just encourage you with some things, some words from a next-gen guy that's been doing this a while, and just based on what our team talked about, that might be helpful for you. You might want to take notes, push pause, grab a piece of paper and a pen, and listen to this for just a second. Number one, celebrate often with your team. Celebrate often with your team. We all need encouragement. Different people and different personalities need a different level of encouragement along the way, but celebrate the stories with your team. As a matter of fact, our lead pastor just started a Slack channel on that app called #Celebrate. It's just stories from the weekend of where you saw God move. And it's just so encouraging to get those stories back of what was going on in a kid's life, or a middle schooler, or a high schooler, or a young adult, or a family member, or a parent. What was happening? What was God up to this past week? And to celebrate that and thank God for what he's doing. We can all find stories of celebration. We just need to look for them. We need to open our eyes and look for them. I know the temptation, though. Sometimes we want to look for some ginormous, huge story that outdoes the last story. And I'm telling you to push pause and write down even the things that you would say are little stories along the way. Number two, avoid being critical. Avoid being critical. I'm doing my best as the leader of a next-gen team here at Mission Hills for us not to be stuck complaining about things. It's so easy. It's so easy. It's so easy as a follower of Jesus. It's so easy as a ministry leader to be cynical and skeptical and critical of everything going on. It's so easy because we're constantly in evaluation mode. I don't know if you're listening to this podcast or watching and you're kind of on the outside looking into the church world, but if you're inside the church world, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We are evaluating things all the time. We're evaluating lights and ambiance and atmosphere and whether that food tasted good or whether we've got enough pizzas ordered or that game hit the mark or that teaching time or the worship time. I mean, we're evaluating all the time, and it's so easy to start to complain about all the things that didn't go right. As a matter of fact, last Wednesday night, you're going to hear this podcast a few months down the road from when this event happened, but it happened. We're at a big church, and we ought to have everything figured out, right? But no, we're not perfect. And even last Wednesday, we had some technical difficulties with our tech stuff going on with music and feedback and on the mic and different things. And you know what? We could be stuck there and complain about it. But here's the reality, everybody. Listen to this. God is faithful. God is good. So be encouraged in that. Avoid being critical all the time. Number 3, change is constant and normal. If you've been in ministry or in church world for any amount of time, you should know by now that change is happening all the time. It does not matter if you're at a small church, medium-sized church, large church. If you're in a ministry, if you're in a parachurch ministry that's in schools, if you're just a parent coming alongside your own kids growing in Jesus, change is all the time. It's all the time. And it's normal. And I've had to remind myself of that so many times, that when change happens, it could be staff change, it could be program changes, it could be adjustment in the vision of the lead pastor, it could be a lot of different things, but change is always happening. It could be a pandemic that hits. It could be Middle East crises around Israel and beyond that impacts your ministry back home in your church. It could be a lot of different things, but change is always going to be happening. So don't be shaken. God is a God who's faithful. So I want to remind you of that today. Finally, number 4 is expect growth. Expect growth in your own life, and then the life of your ministry, in the life of your children, in the life of your athletes, in the life of your students. Expect growth. We ought to all be growing closer to Jesus, right? We ought to be growing closer to Jesus along the way, and so we want to expect some growth. And people ought to expect growth in me. That's part of the Christian journey. So I hope that's true for you. So just a quick review of those 4 things. Number 1, celebrate often with your team. Number 2, avoid being critical. Number 3, change is constant and normal. And number 4, expect growth. We ought to hold each other accountable to that. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we were in Atlanta when we shot the last podcast. And if you haven't checked it out, go check it out. We were around the table, and we, the 4 of us, had a great conversation about some things. I just summarized it. But in Atlanta, we were at a next-gen conference that was focused on anxiety. And we pulled so many things out of that conference. It didn't matter if you were a pastor, volunteer, parent, teacher, coach. There's so much to learn about the next generation and coming alongside of them. And it was a fascinating conversation that we had at that conference, and breakout sessions in the main session with great speakers. I mean, George Barna from Barna Research was there speaking. Shane McDowell was there from Biola speaking on apologetics. I mean, there were some really big hitters, big speakers that were speaking to that. But I've been thinking and praying actually a lot about anxiousness in the next generation. That seems to be a buzzword that's happening. And we just know there's this tsunami, if you will, of depression and anxiety that sometimes can lead to the worst case scenario of suicide in the next generation, or back it off just a little bit. And there's a lot of depression. Counselors and therapists are filling their schedules with the next generation who are coming in, and their parents not knowing what to do about it. In earlier podcasts, I've talked about adolescent development, which certainly has a piece of the puzzle. But there's a book that I want to recommend to you. If you're watching on video, I'm going to hold it up right now. It's called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And it's a great book. His last name is Haidt. Anxious Generation. Friends, it's 300 pages long, and then another 100 pages of references at the back of this book. So 400 pages in total. I'm only halfway through this book, and I believe it's the cutting edge book for the future of Next Gen ministry. I'm not overstating it. Of course, for all those listening who are tuning into this about spiritual things, of course, I'm relying on the Bible. The biblical text and the principles of the Bible is number 1, of course. But this book right here is going to shape the way we think about ministry heading into the future. Why do I say that? Because there are a number of ways that this book impacts what we're going to do. It's split into 4 parts. Let me just mention the 4 parts really fast. Number 1 is Jonathan calls it the tidal wave. In this section, it shows some basic statistics about mental health and what's going on in young people. And if you have not been paying attention, there is a pandemic of mental health issues that are going on in the next generation that we better pay attention to. You better not dismiss it. He calls it the tidal wave. Number 2, the section of the book is called The Decline of the play-based childhood. In this section, he talks about how the nature of childhood has been messed up because children have been deprived of play, of being role models and working through systems of negotiation and trying to navigate what it means to be a follower and a leader. Friends, when I was growing up, I'm part of the Gen X generation, and I grew up in the 80s, and I grew up in a small town of 7,000 people, and I'll never forget, the way you knew where everybody was is there was a pile of bikes in the front yard. Maybe some of you listening are old enough to remember that. We'd go about 4 houses down, pile our bikes in the front yard, and play in the backyard. Every sport imaginable. We'd play even games called Kick the Can. Some of you might remember that game. And we were in the neighborhood, running around, doing all sorts of things. And when it went dusk, that's when we all knew we needed to go home. There were no cell phones. There were no phone calls. Sometimes you might hear an occasional whistle from one of our parents whistling us home in the neighborhood. But we would play growing up. We would, even at school, when we were at school on the playground, we had, monkey bars and slides. And I remember pretending with my friends to walk out the movie Star Wars, and we all choose a character, and we'd push small stones to make piles, and that little pile of stones is a pillow for a bed in the room, and this little pile of stones over here is our wall, and this little pile of stones over here is where the Death Star is. And we would all act it out in our childhood. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have other ways to do that. We just learned through growing up, through playing in childhood, all the way into high school. And so, listen, friends, he argues that we have declined in a play-based childhood, that we've now put cell phones in front of our kids, and that's their play. And that's not the same thing. So which leads to number 3 section of the book, is the rise of the phone-based childhood. So again, as I mentioned, we put phones in front of our children, and this especially harms all of the next generation, but it harms especially girls, because now we've harmed boys and girls, sucking spiritual degradation from them. We've sucked happiness out of them. We've sucked away from them the kinds of things that they would grow and learn in if they didn't have a phone in front of them that they had to navigate with friends in real time. And then finally, the 4th section is this collective of actions to better childhood. And so the psychologist Jonathan Haidt argues that we need to do a better job of putting some actions in place around parenting, schools, governments, tech companies, and young people, or they're going to be trapped in this issue forever. That's why I believe this book is a pivotal point in the change of next-gen ministry, because we just know developmentally that things are getting longer. We just know that cell phones are impacting that. So the most important suggestions of this book, and this is where I'll conclude this podcast today, the most important suggestions are just 5 things. Number 1 is give children far more time playing with other children. Just like in the 1980s, just like in the 70s, into the early 90s, give children tons of time to play. Now, I know what happens. If you're a parent listening, or a teacher, or a coach, or sometimes a youth worker in a church, you're nervous and you're anxious and you're fear-based because you don't want to let your child into the neighborhood all by themselves or play. You don't know who their next door neighbor is, and so you're nervous about that. I get it. But we've got to do a better job of letting them play without cell phones. Number 2 is look for more ways to enable children for stable, real-world communities. I've been talking about this for so long, and I teach our parents at our class at our church about this, but man, we've got to surround the next generation with a community that is a number of adults who are surrounding them in the church world, in the community, coaches, teachers, who are all on the same page working together to help kids become mature, Jesus-following adults one day. 3rd, he suggests in the book, is don't give a smartphone as the first phone. In other words, you could be old school and give them a flip phone, or give them something that just texts messages, but not give them a smartphone as their first phone, because then they have internet connection to anybody in the world. Friends, it does not matter if you put all the safeguards on that phone. The next generation's pretty savvy, they're pretty smart, and their friends probably know how to get past those barriers. So don't give a smartphone as their first phone when they're growing up. The number 4 is don't give a smartphone until high school. I love this. And this is going to go totally against the stream. It's going to go totally against what the next generation actually wants. And it's going to be a fight in your home if you're a parent. But listen, it'll pay off. When my oldest, who's 24 today, got her first smartphone, it wasn't until she was 16 years old. And that made sense because she started to drive. So we wanted to have a smartphone. The joke in our home was, hey, you don't need a smartphone until you're 16 because all of your friends already have a smartphone. If there's an emergency, you could just borrow one of their phones. Well, she didn't think that was very funny. But the reality is you don't need a smartphone when you're in middle school. You don't. There's no reason for it. So maybe think about that. I want to challenge you to think about when you give a smartphone to your child and when they actually need that smartphone. They don't need it for school. The school provides a computer for them, or they can use a computer at school. They don't need a smartphone. And they certainly don't need to be on social media, which leads to the 5th point of this book is he suggests to delay the opening of accounts on nearly all social media platforms until the beginning of high school, at least. And he really encourages it not until maybe 13, 14, 15 years old. All social media. That's Snapchat, that's Instagram. Of course, they're not on Facebook anymore because their parents are. That's TikTok. That's all these social media app platforms. Because here's the reality, and this book lays it out in detail. The statistics are overwhelming that it hurts especially girls, but boys too. Boys are more into video games and that kind of thing. Girls are more into image. Even though both are wrestling with their identity, girls in particular, as soon as the smartphone got a front viewing camera, all of a sudden, all those pictures that are taken in a mirror get posted online. And now all the next generation of particularly girls are looking to see whether they're pretty enough, beautiful enough, and they're comparing themselves to everybody else. And that is causing developmental damage in their lives. So let me just review real quick. Give children far more time to play as children. Second, look for more opportunities to help your child live in real communities with other adults who care for them, other parents. Third, don't give a smartphone as their first phone. 4, don't give a smartphone until high school. And finally, this book recommends delay the opening of accounts for social media until at least high school, but maybe delay it even longer. The other thing he suggests in this book that's a little side item is that schools don't even need phones. When your child goes to school, they ought to turn in all their phones. They don't need a phone. They don't need to do that. As a little story on the side, there was a middle school in North Carolina. You can look up this story that saw that so many middle school girls were going to the bathroom during the day. And they realized that what they were doing is going in the bathroom and taking a picture of themselves in the mirror and then posting it online. Girls were going to the bathroom and asking to be excused up to 9 or 10 or 11 times a day, individual students. Well, they figured this out, the administration and the teachers, and so what they decided to do is remove the mirrors from the girls' bathroom. Sounds crazy, sounds radical, but it changed the number of times that girls were leaving class. And what if we back up a little bit? Why does the next generation need phones at school? We just know statistically they spend hours upon hours upon hours. It's different depending on what studies you look at, but it's way too much time on their cell phones, scrolling through social media, probably comparing themselves, wanting to look like that person or that person. And it is really actually, if I'm being honest with you, ruining the next generation. And we ought to delay that for them as much as we can as mature Jesus-following adults who are surrounding the next generation. So I hate to leave you on a depressing note. I just challenge you to pick up the Anxious Generation book and read the details about it, and then get together with some other parents to discuss it, or youth pastors or other pastors in the church, coaches, teachers, administration, and talk about what can you do to change the tide. Because I realize We are swimming upstream when it comes to these issues, but they're so important to talk about. So I encourage you to pick up the book and to think about these things. Friends, be encouraged today. God is in control. I'm so glad you're tuning into the Next Gen podcast, or you're watching the video as we post this. Continue to do so. Thanks for your support. And please recommend this to others if you think it's helpful along the way. So thanks again so much for tuning in. I'm Jeff Baxter. We'll talk to you next month. Take care. This podcast is hosted by me, Jeff Baxter, along with special guests who are experts in the industry. We're mixed and edited by Leopard Productions. Our senior producer is Colin McFarland. Our video director is Zach Anderson, and our digital and SEO specialist is Maddie Brower. The Next Gen podcast is part of a Mission Hills podcast network here at Littleton, Colorado. Thanks for listening.